You wake up in the middle of the night. Your cat is cozily nested between your knees, and the weight of your blanket warms your tired body nicely. You sigh happily. When you are about to drift again into a sweet slumber, your cat hisses and runs frantically off your bed and hides behind the curtains. She's never acted so oddly before, and that upsets you. You look around in your room for anything that could have startled her, but nothing is out of the ordinary. You stay still and listen for anything unusual. You can hear your cat drinking water from a bowl in the hall, making that disgusting slurping sound that always disturbs you. Relieved that nothing is wrong, you lie back down and pull your blanket up to your chin. But before you close your eyes, you see the shadowy silhouette of your feline friend ducking under your desk, her hair standing up. You gasp. If it isn't your cat drinking water, then where does the sound come from? Slowly, and as silently as possible, you get off your bed. But despite your best efforts, the old wooden framework groans loudly. You freeze. The slurping sound stops for a second before it resumes. Any doubts that this was your imagination's doing are cast away. Heart pounding on your chest, you tiptoe your way to the door. You step out of your room and look across the hallway towards your cat bowl. And there you see her. Your mother, crouching on hands and knees. Her limbs are long and skinny, and her fingers are gaunt and bony. Her messy hair covers her pale, distorted face, her skin stretched against her cheekbones. She is licking greedily the water in your cat's bowl, with a tongue black as coal and twice the normal size. Suddenly, she stops. She slowly turns her head towards you. She stares deeply into your eyes, her pupils two unmoving dots of malice. You jump in panic and run back into your room while your mother gallops on all fours towards you. You close the door behind you, moments before it starts shaking violently, loud bangs echoing across the house. You quickly throw your body against the door, blocking it. The whole doorframe quakes fiercely, but you hold firm. Then, the banging stops. An otherworldly sense of stillness hangs in the air. After a few seconds of excruciating silence, the knob starts turning. "Honey, is something wrong?" You hear your mother's soothing voice from the other side. "Why did you close the door? I'm worried. Please let me in." Well, here I am again. Therapy. In my opinion, it's just a waste of time. How can talking to someone an hour a week actually help them with their problems? I better get it over with, I guess. When I opened the door, cool air surrounded me. You would think after 2 years of coming here I would be used to it, but I wasn't. I signed in and took my seat next to a woman who was reading a book. I could feel my anxiety, and I tried my best to stay calm. It must have been pretty obvious because the woman looked up from her book and smiled at me. "Is this your first time here?" she asked. No, I am a regular." At this point, I started shaking uncontrollably. She laughed and told me there was no reason to be nervous. "You know, I used to be just like you," she continued. "It'll get better, I promise." She grabbed her purse, which had been on the carpet beside her chair, and pulled out a pen and a piece of paper. "Well, If you ever need someone to talk to outside of this place, give me a call." I looked at her, wanting to say something, but I couldn't form the words. She wrote down her number on a piece of paper and placed it in my hand. I stared at it for a while before I heard my name be called. I stood up and walked to the usual room to meet with my therapist. When I opened the door, I noticed my therapist wasn't there. Instead was a man who I suspected to be in his 70s. The man gestured for me to have a seat. I didn't move. "It's okay to be nervous, son. Take your time and get comfortable." He took out a pencil and began writing something down as he waited for me. After about 5 minutes, I finally gathered the courage to sit. I waited for him to say something, but he didn't. He just continued writing. "Where is my usual therapist?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He put down his pencil and looked me in the eyes. At that moment, I felt something different. It wasn't my usual anxiety or depression, but serenity. It was as if, just by looking him in the eyes, all of the previous pain was gone. Something came up and he wasn't able to make it. He picked up his pencil and started writing again. When our eye contact was broken, that sense of peace had left me, and all of the pain came back. Without looking at me, he continued. "I understand you've been having trouble dealing with your anxiety lately." "Yeah, He interrupted me before I could finish. "You don't have to explain. I already have enough information." I didn't know what was going on anymore. His process, or whatever you would call this, wasn't normal. I understand that in normal therapy, you would need to explain your problem in detail, but this isn't normal therapy. I've spent a large portion of my life studying human behavior. He put down his pencil and turned his chair towards the window. But recently, I've discovered more unorthodox methods of therapy. I won't go into any detail, but I will tell you this. If you want to be done with these weekly sessions and live the rest of your life happily, just say the word and I can make it happen." "What are you talking about?" At this point, I was confused, a little scared, but also curious. "If what you're saying is true, why don't you set up your own business and make real money instead of being a sit-in therapist?" He let out a sigh. "Money won't lead you to happiness. I just want to see others enjoy life as much as I do. So, what will it be?" Who was this guy? Could he really get rid of my mental illnesses? I know I shouldn't entertain this offer, but if this guy wasn't crazy and he really could help, I had to know. I accept." "Excellent." He turned from the window and looked at me, and again the pain I felt had vanished. He stood up, still making eye contact, and walked towards me. "Now, remember." He paused. "From this point on, you will be in control. What you say, what you do, how you feel." I nodded in acknowledgement, and he escorted me back to the main lobby. He wished me luck as I signed out and left the building. The world seemed so different to me now. Everything seemed much brighter and lively. For the first time in my life, I felt in control. No more sadness, no more anger, no more anxiety. I could finally do what I've always wanted. I didn't know where to start or who to start with. Remembering the number I was given in the lobby before my session, I pulled out the piece of paper and smiled. Ah, yes. My first victim. As George lay on the tiled floor of the convenience store, currently sinking to the bottom of the North Atlantic Ocean, with various bags of chips and sugar-loaded snacks atop and all around him, he felt as if his soul had stayed above the water. In the pitch-black, suffocating darkness that made his skin shiver like something massive with fuzzy feelers was crawling over him, he had ceased to breathe. If he could bring himself to move, if fear had not slithered up his brainstem and paralyzed him, he would have put his hand on his chest to see if his heart was still pumping blood through his cold, stiff body. While unsure about his soul, his mind was certainly still above, recalling the sprawling boardwalk empire erected in the middle of the sea. It was mostly supported by steel beams drilled and anchored far below into rock. George had been wandering the cityscape shortly before the incident, inhaling the fresh air, admiring the stars and their reflections on the water mixed with the neon glow of the towers, creating a shivering painting. Away from the pollutions of commoners and their filth, one could enjoy such liberties for a high price. He was a lonely fellow, and moving himself to this man-made island had not remedied this. The people he passed on the sturdy, or so he thought, boardwalk may as well have been walking phantasms, for he was incapable of interacting with them. What could he say to the people that knew and had everything? Conversations were not struck here. It was a matter of two people silently deciding to humor the other person and listen to whatever bragging they had to offer about something they likely both owned. Friendship was a facade in this new society. There was not a poor man to be found in the city of Amphitrite, named after the god Poseidon's bride. Yet, the wealthy needed simplicities as much as their underlings, and such cravings led George to the convenience store, located a short walk away from the towers and apartments. He wandered in and perused the expensive versions of food back on land, despite already knowing what he wanted. Anything to put off the feeling of isolation in his apartment. The store was empty, save for himself and the cashier, a young man. He had most likely been brought here by his parents. Lucky brat, George thought, as he spared a glance at him, then returned his gaze to the magazine he was holding. When he grew bored enough, he selected his bottle of poison for the night, a bag of vapid food, and sauntered over to the counter. The cashier wordlessly rung up the price, hardly registering George's presence. The boy was in the right place, he thought. Someone who had found themselves at the top without working their way there deserved servitude. He pulled the money from his wallet and was handing it over when he suddenly felt disoriented. The world seemed to be turning and everything was sliding. As he found himself hurling over the counter, he heard the store crash into the ocean. Steel shutters slammed over the glass windows and doors. The power cut off, and George had died. Or so he believed, as he remained still while the sea swallowed him whole. After what seemed like an eternity, the emergency generator kicked in and the lights snapped back on. He drew in a deep breath greedily, though it felt more like an instinct than a purposeful act. He forced himself up and looked over the counter to see everything in disarray. Soft drinks had flown from the coolers, the doors now hanging wide open. Cheap wine bottles had fallen and shattered, making large, dark puddles. The newspaper rack had turned over, its papers scattered across the floor. The place looked lived in by bums. George looked to the cashier and saw a look of absolute terror plastered on his pale face. "Hey," George said meekly. The boy apparently hadn't heard him and continued to stare at the floor, shocked. George saw by the name tag that his name was Ken. "Hey, Ken." Ken's head snapped up, eyes wide. "What the hell happened?" George asked, with much more panic in his voice than he would have preferred. I don't know," Ken muttered. George let out an aggravated sound and pulled out his phone, quickly dialing for emergency services. He held it up to his ear, wondering how he could explain this when, to his astoundment, he was greeted by the incessant beeping tone of a busy signal. "Try yours," he told Ken desperately. Ken dialed the number with a shaky hand and listened. George waited, praying. Then, as he heard what he feared, he realized that, however far down in the ocean they were now, it was not as deep as the depths to which his heart had sank. "What do we do?" Ken asked. "Those shutters, is there a switch for them? Can we lift them?" "Yeah," Ken said nervously, "but the glass might shatter, and then—" "We're sinking further down every second. We gotta swim." He started towards Ken, looking for the switch in question. "No, wait!" Ken cried. "This has happened before. Back when Amphitrite was still built, they brought in a boat with a crane and pulled up the building." "What? Really?" George asked, incredulous. "Yes, so we need to wait. We might be too far down to swim up now. I don't want to drown." George hesitated. "They're probably pulling us up now." George wanted to believe that. God, he wanted to. But he couldn't stop picturing the entire store plunging down, further than anyone thought possible, deep enough into the sea where one would cease to exist and become a distant memory. He found himself breathing rapidly. "How much oxygen do we have?" he asked. "There are oxygen tanks in the back in case of something like this happening. When they start getting thin, we can use them. I doubt we'll have to resort to that though. We'll be back up any minute now, I'm positive." Right, George thought, cynically. What was the pressure going to do to the building, to their bodies? He closed his eyes and forced himself to take slow breaths, debating with himself. The ocean was teeming with sharks, most likely hungry and aggravated ones at that. How far would he make it before sharp teeth sunk into his leg and shredded his flesh to ribbons? Then his blood would rise and join the painting on the water's surface, little blotches of crimson. He hopped over the counter, forced himself to stop thinking, and grabbed a bottle of pop. For a while, silence hung in the air like a thick fog. George tried his best to think of something happy, somewhere else to be besides stuck in an elevator to hell. Part of him was silently counting down the time. The other half desperately tried to remain ignorant. He dialed emergency services on his phone once more. Still busy. He tried every other contact in his phone, only to have the same result. The busy signal rattled in his head, echoing even after he had given up. A thought came to him, simple and short, yet it sent ripples of paranoia throughout his body. Maybe they had turned his phone off. The people in charge. Maybe they were doing their best to cover this up as soon as possible, pull a blanket over the mess, so as to not cause a panic, so people wouldn't leave. George was a loner. No one was even going to notice he was gone. No one had known he was here when the place sank. As for Ken, who was going to care? He never belonged in the first place. His parents may make a fuss, but with enough money. Something slammed against the glass beyond the shutter, making George jump. His eyes widened as he saw water begin to leak inside. Was it sharks or something bigger? Something struck again, this time making a large dent in the shutters. George's body shivered as he heard a squelching, slithering sound. The leaking water now had glowing green tint to it. The creature had cut itself on the glass and was bleeding. No matter, it continued the onslaught, quickly flooding the store. George backed onto the corner and put his head down between his knees, hands pulling his hair. When the beast finally seemed to subside, a ringing began to reverberate in his ear, so quiet at first that he hadn't even noticed. It gradually grew louder and louder, making George cover his ears, but to no avail. He screamed, but even then couldn't drown out the piercing, drilling sound. Blood began to seep between his fingers, tears sliding down his face. Just when he thought he was going to die from the agony, it stopped. He gasped for air, indifferent to the circumstances. "Ken?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He called again, louder, and received no response. George rose on shaky legs and walked to the counter, making small splashes. He put his hands on the counter and stopped. How much madness would his mind take before it shattered? Or perhaps it was already fractured. He slowly turned to see Ken and discovered that he was wrong. He had been the sane one up until this point. When he saw the luminous tentacle sliding down Ken's throat and his eyes rolled into the back of his head, George felt a sharp pain in his head, followed by a numbing sensation. On instinct, he screamed. He screamed until his lungs were ready to burst. He screamed so loudly that it may have even created a ripple on the surface of the sea. George screamed out what was left of his humanity while the tentacle explored the insides of the boy, its tip pushing beyond one of its pupils until it popped out. The tip waggled at George, as if waving hello. George slid to his knees and then lay back on the wet, tiled floor. In his mind, he could hear Ken's voice, although it was borrowed. It told him that his suspicions were correct. They had turned his phone off. In fact, this was all planned. It questioned George. He didn't think that building a utopia on the sea, where mankind did not belong, would be of no consequence, did he? Paradise came at a price. A building had fallen into the depths the past year, but the rescue story was a lulling fabrication, just as the one regarding George would be, if anyone bothered to inquire. This year had not required a large sacrifice, but next time would require a large sum. His tendrils unfurling delicately toward him, and still speaking in Ken's voice. The creature assured him that Amphitrite would stay and continue to prosper, to grow, and so too would it.